I'm Michael Danner, and I've lived in Vevay all my life, so I have a lot of memories of the Martha A. Graham ferry boat. My recollection of the Martha A. Graham, the ferry boat that crossed from the Ohio River back and forth between Vevay, Indiana and Ghent, Kentucky from the year 1842 to 1978. Martha Ann Graham was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. David Lester and the wife of Robert T. Graham, the owner of the previous ferry and also the owner of the Martha Graham. The first ferry boat that was in Vevay was a man-powered ferry in 1811, and then the first steamboat ferry was in 1848. And of course the Martha A. Graham was 1842 to 1978. The Martha Graham was a unique, beautiful side-wheel ferry boat. The ferry was propelled by a diesel engine centered on the side of the boat in a cabinet-like structure, which were built over each of the sides of the boat to cover the side wheels of the ferry. The two wheels were open to the view on the outside of the boat, centered on the opposite sides. The big paddle wheels turned as they would dip quickly into the water and make their circles. The large boat steering wheel that stood about 4 feet tall, that could be used from either side of in the direction the ferry was going. This meant that the captain would move to either facing Kentucky or facing the Indiana landing once the crossing began. This also allowed the vehicles to load and face the direction in which they were going to cross and unload without turning the ferry around. Only the captain would walk around the wheel and generally sit on his stool and drive the ferry. I used to go up and visit with the captains, as many people did, and tell stories or listen to what was going on by them. The Steel Hall ferry had a rather large deck for vehicles and was wide enough for two vehicles side by side. The ferry could hold up to 10 cars or a semi-truck with 4 cars. Whatever the mix was, they would fill the deck when needed to do so. Cars ran $1 to cross the river, walk-ons were $0.25. Large trucks, depending on the size and load, varied in price, probably not over $5. Ferry hours. The ferry hours were from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Even in the heaviest of morning fogs, the ferry would cross the river, blasting its horn to notify any other boats in the area that the ferry was crossing the river, maybe in an oncoming boat's path. Boat horns, whistles, bells were used before the use of radar and radios today. The crossing, if you were lucky and the ferry was at the landing you were at, would take only about 15 minutes to cross. If you weren't so lucky and the ferry was going across toward the opposite side, you just missed it by the time it would unload and reload it and get back for you and take you across the river. Could be 45 minutes or so. Vevay was in a split time zone area. If you were connected to Cincinnati, Ohio, northern Kentucky area, you went fast time, so we called it, which was Eastern time zone. However, if you were more connected to Indiana, Indianapolis, and Louisville, Kentucky, you went slow time, Central time zone. The ferry ran on fast time. 6 p.m. would be 5 p.m. slow. If you missed the ferry's closing time, the nearest bridge was at Madison, Indiana, 20 miles to the west, or Cincinnati, Ohio, 60 miles to the east. In the longer hours, in the fall and winter, a high school basketball game that played a team that would be across the river, the ferry would run late to accommodate the teams, the spectators, and also for special occasions such as fairs and festivals would run longer. In the fall, since tobacco was the main money crop of this area and the large burley tobacco warehouses were in Carrollton, Kentucky, the farmers from Indiana, especially Switzerland County, would haul their tobacco across the river by ferry in large loads, bundled and ready for sales at Carrollton, Kentucky. The trucks, wagons, whatever were hauled free because the tobacco warehouses would pick up the fee for the ferry boat. High water. The ferry ran year-round, even in high water. The ferry would sometimes have to set and wait out a bad storm, though. The trip across the river would take longer in high water because the ferry would run upriver a bit further to cross, so it would have to drift, have a slight angle to cross and catch a landing just perfect. Now in high floods in the Indiana side flattens out at the top of the bank into lower fields, which is now the Paul Ogle Riverfront Park. Therefore the ferry would travel downriver to the old coal yard, a gravel street that ran fairly steep up to Market Street. This area is Silver Street near Jennings Park. Captains I remember well were Ep Pillman. He lived in Vevay and ran the ferry for the Graham family, as I remember in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. He was quite a good captain for the ferry boat. Ep lived close to the river in what is now the Paul Ogle Park in Vevay Riverfront Park, and he raised his family there and watched and took care of the ferry boat. Young men were the deckhands that would handle the cables at each end of the ferry before the ramps, taking the fees for the ride, making sure everything was running fine and all vehicles would get on and off safely. Ep Pillman's son was also a deckhand. The ferry would dock overnight on the side of the river where the captain lived. There were large chains and hooks in the ground on each side of the river for the ferry to tie up to at night. The Grahams sold the ferry to Clayton Arney of Ghent, Kentucky in the 60s, who became the pilot along with his deckhand, James Bond, who they called 007, also a Ghent, who became a captain at an early time. Both men took times of running the ferry boat up till the time the Markland Bridge was completed. Clayton's son was also a deckhand. The Martha Graham had its own distinctive thumping sound as the sidewheel paddles pounded the water and banged the water moving across the river. The sound would vibrate and could be heard a long ways off. Barges moving have a much quieter sound because their props are under the water and run much smoother. The Markland Dam Bridge was completed in 1978 at Markland, just 7 miles east of Vevay, which meant the demise of the ferry at Vevay and Ghent. A group called Save the Ferry tried to buy the ferry, but couldn't come up with the needed funding to do so. More importantly, the cost of operating the ferry was with much less traffic to cross the Vevay and Ghent versus crossing at a new bridge 24 hours a day versus a ferry's 12 hours per day would drastically reduce its income. The Martha Graham was sold and driven down the Ohio River out of the crossing on the Ohio between the hills of Kentucky and Indiana and the towns of Vevay and Ghent. A sorrowful loss of history. I've seen a picture of what was left after the ferry was sunk on the Missouri River, so I was told. The deck of the ferry was made into a boat ramp along the Missouri River and the upper parts were gone. Very disappointing for an old man of the river. Over the years that the Martha Graham traveled back and forth across the river, many folks enjoyed the boat ride, taking pictures of the river and the ferry as it would land crossing the river. I started painting oil paintings over the ferry in the early 1960s and have painted many pictures of the Martha Graham over the years. I just finished a painting early this year, 2022. I guess you might call me a river rat, as I love the river, and as a young boy I spent a lot of time playing along the edge of the river, watching the ferries cross the river, skipping rocks, picking up mussel shells, being a part or whatever. My father had a skiff that we often went fishing in, which made a wonderful ride for a kid like me. I have other stories to tell about the river because I lived on the river. I water skied. I had a floating restaurant in the river for several years right below where the ferry would land. And so these stories that I tell are quite interesting, I hope, to you and all the people concerned. Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Mike Jones and I am a lifelong resident of Switzerland County. I grew up in the Patriot area. I was very interested in coming today to speak about the Martha Graham and the ferry boats and how they were such a part of our culture here in our county. I don't think a lot of people realize how travel to the south, to Kentucky, would have been before the Markland Bridge, but you had to rely basically on, in my lifetime, two ferry boats, one at Warsaw, Kentucky, and then one at here in Vevay with the Martha Graham. We had family that lived in Gallatin County, Kentucky, and in those days, going over there, it wasn't like today where you had a bridge 24/7. Your ability to visit with your family was very much tied to the hours that the ferry boat operated. And if something happened that you missed that 6 o'clock closing, then you had to either drive to Madison or to Cincinnati because there was no bridge at that time in Lawrenceburg. Also, as a college student, I went to Georgetown College in Kentucky, and my parents would bring me here to the Martha Graham, and I would pay a quarter and cross as a passenger, and then my grandparents would pick me up in Kentucky to take me to a friend that I rode back and forth to school. The other connection that the ferry boat had to Switzerland County was in the area of agriculture, because if you go back about 2 generations and then before that, every farm in Switzerland County had a tobacco base. And if you lived in the eastern part of Switzerland County, there was a good chance that you took your tobacco to Carrollton, Kentucky, to the market. So again, you had to rely on the ferry boats to transport your commodities across the river. The other memory I have related to business in Switzerland County would have been when the U.S. shoe factory was in operation in Randall's, because many of the employees lived in Kentucky. So if you would go in the early morning or in the afternoon, you might be in a line of 30 to 40 cars of people either coming into work or getting off the work. And looking back on it, the ferry boats were, we thought it was a great luxury, but it was also somewhat of a challenge if you're traveling to Kentucky. And I'll conclude with one of my memories was crossing on the Martha Graham. I was just a young boy, and something happened. The engine stalled, and of course the boat began drifting downriver. And I can just remember my dad really wasn't, because he had traveled in the military on a boat, but how scared my mother was. Luckily they were able to get the engine restarted and correct itself, but occasionally I will go to Rising Sun and ride the ferry boat that operates there just to bring back some of those memories as a child. And again, it's been a great pleasure for me to come and discuss my memories of the Martha Graham. Thank you.
My name is Leona Adams. I've been married before, so I have some other names. People in Vevay, a lot of them know me as James, and I was a Stutzman girl and grew up on the river. My dad was a lockmaster at the dam. But we rode the ferry boat as a child, and I remember if we went to Louisville, we came to Vevay and rode this ferry boat. But if we was going to Cincinnati or somewhere that way, we went up and rode the Warsaw ferry. I know my mother-in-law, Dorothy James, loved to ride the ferry boat, and sometimes if we walked down to the river, that was lots of years ago, we would ride over it back and forth, and he never charged her. And with my dad, he never ever charged us in the car because he was at the dam, and they talked to the people on the river boats when the river was going to be the gates were going to be open, or when the dam was going to be put down, because that would make the river higher and lower. So he knew all the men on the ferry boats all up and down the river. One of my, kind of sad, but it was memorable, my first husband, Paul Freddie James, was in service and he was getting sent to, he thought Korea when he left, but he ended up going to Germany. But I put him on the ferry boat with his duffel bag, and he caught a bus at Ghent and went to Fort Knox, went to Louisville and then to Fort Knox, and went to Germany. And I never seen him for 18 years. 18 months. In between times, I had a son, Paul, who loves the river. And we used to love just to ride the ferry boat. Daddy would take us, to ride the ferry boat, and he knew them all. So I enjoyed the river. I love the river because it's always meant so much to me. And as a child, the river here in Vevay was nothing like it is now, because the ferry boat a lot of times could not run because the river was so low that it didn't even come up to the landing for the ferry boat. But it's been a nice time to live on the river. We've been so lucky around here to have beautiful scenery and beautiful memories of the boats going up and down the river.
My name is Edsel Datraw. I've been a resident of Vevay all my life, and I got a few little stories to tell about the old Martha Graham Ferry. Charlie Tyson was the first pilot that I remember, and after him was Ep Day, and Ep Day has a little funny story. He smoked Lucky Strike cigarettes, and when I was a kid they let you go up in the pilot house, and he would take the cigarette pack when he finished one and stick it inside the next one, and he had them up around the whole top of the cabin and down the sides. And I always remember that as a kid. Then there was Clayton Arney, and his deckhand that run the apron on the boat was named James Bond. We always got a kick out of that. I remember going one time with the Spencers to a ball game at Carrollton, Kentucky, and to go we had to take the ferry over, and then they stayed open until 10 o'clock that night so we could come back. And that was unusual, but they were willing to do that. And then I remember going to the city with my folks. We used to go about every Monday. My dad would pick up parts and stuff, and we'd have to hurry home to catch the ferry before it shut down, because if it already shut down, then you had to go clear to Madison to come around. It was a long trip. Mike Danner and I, when we were kids, played in Danner's hardware store, and we were about 10, 11 years old, and Emmett Danner, Mike's dad, had us take our bicycles and go down to the ferry and ride across and go into Ghent and take flyers for the store and ride around, and we thought we'd really done something great. We remember doing that. And then I remember one other story. A friend of mine worked over at the power plant at Ghent, and riding across the ferry, it was a very foggy morning, and they put him out on the front, on the apron itself, which was usually not done, but they had so many people going over there that they tried to put all they could on. And they got out there, he was on the front of the boat and in the fog, and he looked up, and here was a barge crossing right in front of him, and they had to turn the ferry around sideways real quick and kept from anything happening. That's the memories I have.
Hi, I'm Janet Hendricks. My maiden name was Miller. My family has lived in Switzerland County, different ones of Switzerland County, in Switzerland County on both sides, since about 1816, some before, some after. My father grew up on the river, and the ferry was always there. The Martha A. Graham, I think, started in 1942, and that was after my father came back from the service. But I have a picture of of my father and some gentlemen, friends of his, sitting on the riverbank. And he always took us to the river, and of course the ferry was there every day, morning through evening. And it was just something I always did. Now that I'm a retired school teacher, I find myself going to the river for a while, reading, watching the barges. I miss the ferry. It was just part of our daily lives. Coming to the river with my father and my sister was very special, and if nothing else, he would drop us off to church and then come back, and we would see him afterwards, and he would take us down to the river again. Now, the ferry was there until it closed after the dam was built, and it was a constant icon. Now, I should explain that the ferry house, the river, were parts of our growing up. If I took the summer reading program at the library, at the end of one of the programs, the big special event, is we had a picnic at the ferry house. Now, it was in ruins and we were outside, but it was still the most important place to go. And we could watch the ferry, and we could have to stay away from where the cars went, of course, but that was just part of it. As I grew up, I found out that my 6th grade, 7th grade teacher, and eventually the woman who was head of the English department when I started teaching, she was from the family that owned the ferry house, grew up in it, and her family had the ferry. And that made it even more special. Now, becoming a teenager, a little more freedom, because I was watched, and I had a lot of fun. And I had to be careful because my sister told on me. But I found out that my friends would go down to the ferry, and they would get on it. And if you didn't get off, they just let you ride for free. So a few times then, I would get on the ferry, feel the way everything felt as it moved, hear and feel the vibration of the motors, and experience that feeling of the power of the river. I think that's what it was, the power of the river. So I never got off, but I found out that my friend did, and had a girlfriend there, and the girlfriend had a brother, and so those two had fun and visited back and forth. But again, I was watched, so I didn't do that. I will tell you that, of course, from time to time my parents went to Kentucky, and then of course we rode on it and everything. When I started teaching, I found out that I was invited by some of the kids who were in 4-H. They were going to ride their bicycles crossing the ferry, and they were going to bike then to Butler Park downriver in Carrollton. And my husband at that time said, yes, we'll get our bikes and we'll go. We all went down there. We had our money. One of the fathers of the bikers stood up and he said, no, he says, it's going to cost too much money. Load everybody on my truck, put their bikes on the truck, and we'll just pay a larger fee and get them on there. It was interesting. On the way back, I still had to be out there and feel it. I didn't want to sit in the truck the whole time. But the best thing about the ferry, way before I married my husband, when I brought him down, or he brought me down to meet my family, is I took him to the river. And the best thing in the world is being on the ferry, not in a car, just on the sides, and having a sweet kiss as you cross the Ohio River. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Larry Tolbert. I'm an old retired businessman from this community. We originally came from central Indiana, came down here with 4 children, rented a house across from the Dairy Queen, and the kids would come in and ask for a quarter. We assumed they were going to the Dairy Queen to get ice cream. We later found out they were actually going down to the ferry because they could ride across the ferry for a quarter, and if they didn't get off, they could ride back for the same quarter. So we finally put a stop to that, and it's like, okay, you're. But then I have, at one time there was a floating restaurant at the ferry landing, originally put in there by Mike Danner, and I'm sure he's told many stories about that. But then it was later sold to Edsel Datral. One morning Edsel called me and he said, did you take your boat out? And I said, no, why? He said, well, it's not here. So I assumed somebody stole it, and I went on down there, and when I got down there, the crew off of the ferry, Martha Graham, was on the deck of the restaurant, and they were probing along the deck, and it's like, what are you guys doing? He said, we're looking for a boat. And it was a very foggy morning. They had actually hit my boat, and they didn't know what happened to it. But later that day, later that morning, there was a towboat called in and said, hey, there's a boat floating down here by Carrollton, so we assumed it was mine. Luckily, the boat wasn't actually damaged, so it's like, well, we were glad it wasn't sunk. There's a lot of foggy day stories about the Martha Graham, and I'm sure there are people I'm sure Mike Danner covered them all. Okay, there's one story that I forgot that was I actually had experienced it a few times, and when we came down here, Vevay it had a lot more businesses at the time, but as far as a major shopping area went, the closest thing was Florence, Kentucky, and obviously to get there we had to cross the ferry. And I can remember a few times my wife and I went up to Florence, and she would be shopping and she didn't want to quit, and I'd be looking at my watch, and I'm thinking, oh, we got to get started back. And I'd finally mention, it's like, we only got this long to get back to the ferry. And there was 2 specific times that we wound up driving to Madison to get back to Vevay because her shopping adventure turned out to be way too long. But anyway, we had some experiences with the ferry, and it was like, if they were pulled up there but the crew hadn't left, you could say, hey, and they still wouldn't. It's like, sorry, we're closed. So you would drive to Madison. But those were some fun experiences that, at the time they were desperate. You had 4 kids at home that they expected you to be home before dark, and then you wind up, and it's like, but those are, and I'm sure there's many people. I think of the guys that worked at Dow Corning, and they depended on the ferry for their transportation to get to Kentucky. And I am sure that if you could talk to some of those people, they could tell you some real wild experiences, because it went, fog or not, it had to go. Of course, obviously, they communicated with the towboat, so there wasn't issues with that. But that was a problem that they managed to deal with. And those guys that had to ride that ferry every morning, foggy or not, I often wondered, it's like, how many close calls did they have? But anyway, that's my story, and I think I'm all done now. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Scudder. I grew up in Vevay. My maiden name was Ricketts, and I lived on Main Street in Vevay. And my story about the ferry is that a friend of mine, her name was Jerry Lynn Gullion. She's Jerry Lynn Kemper now. when we were kids, we would get a quarter from our parents, and they didn't know we did this, but we would go down to the ferry and we pay our quarter and we would ride the ferry, and we knew that if we stayed on the ferry, we would not have to pay another quarter to go back. So we would just ride the ferry a couple times, 2 or 3 times across the river. We were all over that boat. We would go up in the captain's quarters, and I know and feel sure as an adult they were not happy we were on that boat. Probably worried we would fall off and drown, and then they'd have to tell our parents. So the other memories of the ferry boat would be, as a kid, we had family that lived in Ohio, and I can remember it was real important to get back in time to catch the ferry to get back to Vevay. We would travel through Kentucky, and I can remember my dad speeding, trying to get there in time to catch the ferry and hoping there was not high water and they closed early. If we missed it, then we would have to drive to Madison, Indiana, which was probably about 20 to 25 miles further, to cross the bridge and get back to Vevay. That is pretty much my stories about the ferry. It was a big part of our town and our life living on the river. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Lisa Rosenberger, and my memories of the ferry boat, I'm not sure that I ever knew the name of the ferry boat, but my memories are several. My family and I used to go on vacations, and it never failed that when we came back, we didn't have any money left. So when we get on the ferry boat, we would literally have to pool our money to pay for it. Now, it didn't cost much, but even the kids, we had to pull out our quarters and our dimes and our nickels just so we could get across the ferry boat. It never failed. Every time we went on vacation, that was what happened. And I always thought, everybody had a ferry boat. I didn't know that was a weird kind of thing. When I was a kid, we used to go down, and if it wasn't very busy, it cost a quarter, I remember, to walk on and to get over to the other side to Ghent. But if we didn't get off, he wouldn't take our quarter. So we'd go down and ride the ferry. If there wasn't anything else to do in town, we'd go ride the ferry, and it was a good thing. Now, if they started getting busy, they'd make us get off, but that was okay. So the ferry was still running when I was in college, and like I said, I thought that riding the ferry boat was the most natural thing. So some friends of mine from college, we had gone to Florida over spring break, and we were coming back to my house. And so we got on the ferry, and one of my friends, she just went crazy. I mean, she was like, "We're going to die. We're going to drown. It's going to tip over." I'm like, "I've ridden this ferry boat my entire life. We're going to be fine." All the way across. She was just totally crazy. And it didn't occur to me that she'd never been on a ferry boat before. But we made it, and it was an experience that was good. Actually, she was one of my friends that also saw the end of the ferry boat, because right before they opened the bridge, they didn't made the ferry boat go away. Right before they did that, we walked down and watched one of the queens, either it wasn't the Delta Queen, it was one of the American Queen, lock through the dam. And so I think she was a lot happier when we had a bridge, when she didn't have to ride the ferry again. But the ferry boat was a wonderful thing. I miss it today. Sometimes when you get a lot of traffic and everything, and I'd say, I wish the ferry boat was here. We could just get across there, take less time than driving up to the bridge and going across. But I was sad to see it go.
Yeah, I'm David Pillman, and this is about my grandpa ran the ferry boat here in Vevay, from Vevay to Ghent. He ran it for 45 years on the Ohio River, and he was the captain on it. He ran, and when I was little, he always take me down on the right across the ferry. He put me down on the bottom, on the bottom level there, and then when there were a lot of cars and trucks, and especially when you haul like the tobacco on the Ohio River across the ferry, and they always, like passengers, when they want to ride on, they had to pay their quarter. It was a quarter fee, and when they took the ferry boat off the river, a lot of people rode it. That's about it.
My name is Barry Knaus. I was born and raised here in Vevay, born in 1960 when the ferry boat was still here. We used the ferry boat quite often. When I was a kid, we were tobacco farmers, and we would go down and go across to Ghent, Kentucky to get to Carrollton to sell the crops, and sometimes there would be maybe 6 to 8 2-ton trucks full on there. As a young kid, it was scary. How do I put it? The boat had to go upriver. The waves in the wintertime might be really strong, and as a kid with all that weight and all those big trucks, it was kind of scary. But then as I got older, using the ferry boat was it was just fun. We'd ride our bikes down. It was a quarter a wheel, so it was 50 cents to go over and 50 cents back, or 25 cents on foot. Sometimes we would ride and go to the top of the hill and eat at a restaurant there and come back over. A real good story I had was when we were in school, 4 of us decided that our superintendent lived in the town across the river of Ghent, Kentucky, and he had a big tobacco crop, and we was raising money up to buy our own cars, so he asked if I wanted to go over and cut tobacco and help harvest the crop. We said yes, and so we skipped school, and we got off at the 4-way stop in Vevay and walked down and went across, but the ferry boat closed at a certain time, and I don't really remember, but I think it's 7, and we didn't make the boat coming back, and we had to call our fathers, and my dad had to go 20 miles downriver to Madison to go across the bridge to come and get us, and we didn't skip school anymore. Well, we still skipped school, but we didn't get caught anyway. But yeah, we did not make the ferry back over, so we had to go all the way down to Madison and back up with our father. And needless to say, he was upset with the superintendent because he's the superintendent of our schools and he knew we were skipping school. Anyway, I missed the boat. A lot of people miss it. I've since purchased a sign that was on the boat. We have a painting. We have a lot of pictures, a lot of articles. I know my father really loved that boat. A lot of people did, even though it was more convenient and to have the bridge at the Markland Dam and cheaper. I think that my dad would have preferred that boat stayed here forever.
My name is Frank By, and I lived here from about 1958 to 1971. What I remember about the ferry boat, we lived down on Cedar Avenue, and at the bottom of Silver Street, there was another road that went on down to the river. Coal yard down there, Benedict, I believe Benedict's coal yard, supplied the coal to all the houses and stuff here in Vevay for heating purposes. And when the river got high and flooded in the spring, if it got high enough to where they couldn't use the ferry landing off the bottom of Ferry Street, they would tool down the river to that landing there on the bottom of Silver Street. And I always used to step outside the house where we lived and watch them sometimes, and it just amazed me that how he could pilot that boat in that rushing river when it was high. But I guess years of practice and patience, and he was pretty good at it. They'd pull up, the cars, of course, would get off, and new cars would get on, and they'd fight the river. He'd get as close to Kentucky as he could, then he would go upstream to hit the Ghent landing. But I remember one day, I guess the river was a little wilder than he thought, and he tried for probably the better part of 45 minutes to dock there on the Indiana side at the bottom of Silver Street, and it was just too rough. The current was too swift, and he kind of lost control and drifted back out towards the middle of the river. And if I remember correctly, he finally got it to shore down here somewhere around Lamb. But the people that run the boat were really always very nice people. You know, as kids, a lot of us kids would get out for our bikes and ride over to Kentucky and ride back. And sometimes they wouldn't charge us, and sometimes they charged us a whole nickel. But it was just something that the kids, we just did, pass the time in our busy metropolis here at Vevay. That's really about the highlight. I know it's not much, but I mean, I remember going across the river quite a few times, especially in the summer. You'd leave Vevay at, say, 5 o'clock, and you get to Ghent at 4:40 or 4:45 because of the time difference, or excuse me, about 6:35, I'm sorry. And coming back, it was the opposite. You gain an hour coming to Indiana, but you lose an hour going to Kentucky. It just amazed me that the daylight savings time and how it changed different places. That's really about all I can, the highlights, other than just riding the ferry. I just remember that flooding and how he worked so hard to get that boat into that landing there by Benedict Code Yard.
Hello, I'm Sharon Peelman Corbin. I'm Ep Peelman's oldest granddaughter, and the fondest memories of the ferry boat that I remember is going down there. Sometimes Grandpa would let me go collect the money from the people, and I would collect my quarters at the time is what it was, and take them upstairs to Grandpa and give it to him. And I can remember one day I was there collecting, and a girl had a birthday, same as mine, and brought out a great big giant Tootsie Roll. I've never seen before for my birthday because it was also her birthday, and I thought that was neat. And I just love watching going across the water with Grandpa up there, and sometimes he let you steer a little bit, and that was neat. And just all the memories of him going down there and watching and having a good time. Even with my siblings on there, we'd all get out and bend over and look at it. We couldn't wait to get there. We lived in Bellevue, Kentucky then. And every other weekend, Dad would write us all down. And going across the ferry, we'd see Grandpa, and we'd be waving at him out the window like little kids would, and couldn't wait to get over there. And it was everything about the country and being over there was just so peaceful and restful. And Grandpa and Grandma, when we leave, the funniest thing was when we'd all leave, we'd get in the car, and I bet they walk a half a block down the road saying goodbye. And we'd be saying, they're still here, they're still here. And Grandma be following behind, still talking to us. But I sure do miss them. I had a wonderful Grandma and Grandpa, and I love the country for being in the city all the time. I love going to Grandma and Grandpa's, and just so many good memories about the ferry boat. Taking my girlfriend all the time. I'd take my girlfriend for Swiss Wine Festival, and she loved it. Always came down for that, and it was a big thing for us.
I'm Pete Browning.
And I'm Marianne Browning Jones now.
And we lived there most of our life, and we lived down on the river on the corner, a big two-story white house. And I remember riding over with my mom and them. Usually on a Sunday, we'd go over and see my dad's sister over around Sparta, Kentucky. And then I rode over one time at the dentist office across the ferry years ago. And Marianne's probably got some more on that.
Oh, yeah. I was, like he said, we lived right there within a block and a half, maybe 2 blocks from them. And Ep was the pilot of the boat. And I was good friends, well, I knew them all, but his daughter and I, Linda, that's her name, that was his daughter, I got to ride with them up in the pilot house many days. And it was interesting, it was fun. And I remember sometimes he would let Ep, the pilot of the boat, he would let
kids out there they'd be out there on the end where the cars and things come on, and he'd let them ride out so far and let them then swim back into shore. And when he would go over to the Kentucky side from the Indiana side, he would sit there and, and wait as long as he could to see if he was going to get somebody to come back on, so he wouldn't have to make the trip empty. But if somebody showed up on the Indiana side, he would go ahead back over and pick them up. They'd blow the horn and he'd go back and pick them up. Let's see, what else? And I have seen as many as 6 cars at a time on it. And they had big, long chains that went from the side to side to the boat. And they would always hook the chain.
Yeah, I think they always had one guy doing that, didn't they?
Yeah, well, his son, Gene, did that for quite some time. That's Ep's son, the pilot. And let's see, and Ep was a good man.
I'm Leonard Arney, son of Clayton Arney, which owned the Martha A. Graham. And in our household, our time was not always pleasant. It was a work, it was a business. So Dad, he would always take care of the boat and the property as far as the landings. And there was times, we'd be down there and we'd have to put new blacktop, put rocks in the water to pour blacktop, and just a lot of things that a lot of other people didn't see. My dad was a pilot, and there was James Bond was a pilot, and there was also Hubert Mefford. And those are the pilots I knew of. When I was younger, Dad got my Social Security and I worked deckhand, so that was my job. And some of the pleasant things I remember seeing at the river and from the ferry were just when the wine festival here, when it first started, the river was full of boats, and there was just always things going on. They had skiers coming through, and they would jump ramps, and the river was full of boats. It was a busy time. It was a good atmosphere. And then when the wine festival, you'd have people come across the boat that were entertainers. So I got to meet like the Midwestern Hayride, those people, things like that. And then they would bring huge trucks of grapes. So I'd always get big clusters of grapes, when they would come across for the stomping and the activities at the wine festival. So when I was younger, we would tie up the boat, and I would work from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock. That was my time slot, because the other pilots would work 12 hours, 6 to 6. And then we would, Dad and I would go down and work the last 2 hours in the summer, and then we'd tie up. And then after that, then my friends and older people would come down and we would fish off the ferry. It was just a good time. And there again, I was saying about things that weren't pleasant. Like running a ferry boat, there's breakdowns, a lot of breakdowns. And I've seen my dad work many hours down there, making repairs. I know the wine festival, it was a big deal, because both the landings were full of cars, and people were happy. That was in 77, 78, the river froze over. And we had to go down, and me and my brother Gary and my dad, we went down, and it was locked in ice. So we were on the river with chainsaws cutting the paddles out. So he said, I've got to get this boat running and get some water moving under it so that it doesn't get crushed by the ice. And there were times when I was younger in the winter, Dad would get me and we'd have bags of salt on the back of the truck, and he would back down the hill and I would spread salt, and we'd go down and then get on the boat, and then we'd go up the other Indiana side here. And Then another thing I remember was nice is after we did that, we would come up to these restaurants and I'd get hot chocolate and Dad would visit with his friends and have coffee, you know. But there was a lot of times on the boat that it was usually a quarter. I've seen a lot of people come down and, you know, give $2 or $3 and just ride back and forth, and they just would, you know, just enjoy it. Another story is friends of ours, Norman and Debbie Abbott. They crossed the ferry. They lived in Kentucky in Ghent. Crossed the ferry and got a license. Then they came back to get married in Kentucky, and then realized they could not get married in Kentucky with an Indiana license. So my dad, he took them back to Indiana. This was after ours, I'm sure. And so he took them back, waited on them, and then brought them back to Kentucky so they could be married. And they're still our friends. You know, I was talking about cost and things. You know, what things I saw was fuel, breakdowns, engines, motors, belts, pulleys, you know, leaks, dry dock, you know, just a lot of cost involved in that. But it was for me, a good growing up. I have one more story, and this one involves a Dr. Cotton from Carrollton and his wife. They had an amphibian car which had the propellers on it and everything, and they were going from Ghent to Vevay, and they didn't have their doors locked and the car sank. So I guess they went through their insurance and everything, and Dad said, if I can find it, can I have it? And they said, sure. Well, Dad, he got a diver. Where he did, I have no clue, but this diver found the car and marked it. So after ours, Dad took the boat out there. I think they put a balloon or something and marked it. The diver went down, and we had, I believe there was a wrecker on the boat. So they take the boat out to the car with the wrecker, pull a cable out, get a hold of this car, and they drag it best they can as close to the bank. Then they unhook everything, get the wrecker on the bank, and then bring the car up and bring it to our house. And so I remember there was Johnny Davis, Hubert Medford, I think Sam Earls, Jimmy Tingle, my dad. There was just all the people that were around Ghent that were business owners standing around this car, and the water's running off of it. So Dad, he worked on it and got this car running. And this car, it was the coolest thing. I was in it once, and we were coming around people waiting to get on the ferry, and he went around them real fast, and it was convertible also. So he was pushing on the clutch and saying, the brakes are out, the brakes are out. And so people, you could see their heads out of their cars like, oh my goodness. And he'd hit that water and put it in gear and take off. It was just, that was a fun car. So that's my last story.
My name is Carol Furnish. I grew up in Vevay, Indiana, and I know a little bit about the ferry. My parents worked, and so pretty much what we ended up doing is we had free run of the town. So a lot of us would go down to the ferry. If you had a quarter, you could ride across the river. And if you did not get off and go to Ghent, you could ride back for free sometimes. I tended to take my bicycle and pay the quarter and go over to Ghent just for something different to do. And they didn't charge me once I got back on the ferry. I had to pay a quarter for both ways. And I enjoyed I think those guys put up with a lot. You'd ask them a lot of questions, you'd hang out, you were loafing. I think that's pretty much my story. I do have a story about my sister though. She taught school, she taught at the high school, and she went to school in Kentucky. And she would end up going to Lexington on the weekends and come back on Sunday night. My grandmother grew up on Market Street and could see the ferry. So every Sunday night, she would look to make sure that my sister got on the ferry in time. And Sunday night, you had to be on the ferry the last trip across. It would vary. It would be sometime between 5:30 and 6. And if you didn't make the ferry on time, you had to drive down to Madison and go across the bridge. So if my grandmother didn't see my sister's car, she called my mom. So I got to hear about it. Okay, that's it.
My name is John Kinman, and I grew up in Switzerland County on the river. Our farm was on the river, and I was quite familiar with the ferries, all three of them. The one in Lamb, which I do not remember the name of, and which actually stopped operation in the late 40s or early 50s, I think. I'm not exactly sure. But the Martha A. Graham in Vevay, and the ferry that was located above Florence and ran over to Warsaw, Kentucky. I'm not exactly sure what the name of that ferry was either. But when you grow up on the river and you're a little kid, going across that ferry was like going across the ocean. It was just wonderful. It was a wonderful experience, and was like a highlight of the trip, which we would take on Sundays, not every Sunday, but we would either go to Madison, cross the bridge, and come up the Kentucky side and come back on the ferry, or take the ferry across, go down the Kentucky side, and come back across the bridge to our farm. It was, to a child, it was like a mystical experience when you got out on the river and you could look up and down and see the boats, and you hoped that there would be a towboat coming by, or one would come close. And then when I got older, I attended college in Georgia, and to start my trip in the fall, I would always take the ferry across the river and head south. But when I got about to the middle of the river, I would always take a penny and throw it in the river for good luck or fortune, whatever it may bring. And that's just about all I've got. So, I remembered another story. My Aunt Cozy, who lived in Lamb, Indiana, right across from Carrollton, when she was a young girl, she would go to high school in Carrollton and take the ferry across, because if you came to Vevay to high school, you would have to board all week, stay with someone, and they didn't have the money for her to stay with someone, so she would take the ferry across to Carrollton, go to high school, and then after school come home. It worked out rather well, very convenient.
Hi, my name is Beverly Buckman. I'm from Lake Wells, Florida. Lived in Indianapolis for a number of years, worked for DNR, but my family's originally from Vevay. And my grandmother, Granny Hughes, I don't know her first name, it was Granny to me. And she lived in a house, it was on Main Street, it was one of the very last houses on Main Street, and during the big flood, they watched the house float away, along with all our family records and pictures and all the information. Then she moved in with the Grant family that ran the ferry boat, and she lived there with them for I don't know how many years, but it was quite a while. And went on the ferry boat a lot of times. It was really cool. And so anyway, that's my connection with Vevay. Not a whole lot, but there it is.
Hi, my name is Marlene Blanton. I used to be a Cole, which my mother was Martha Cole, and she was in the Graham family because my grandma name was Clara Graham. Mom was named after the ferry boat, the Martha A. Graham. Some things one thing in particular I can remember is she would speak about her and all of her sisters and some of the brothers, because there was a total in the family, there were 8 children. When she would stay there at night, the pilot would shine his light in her bedroom window. And also, I believe, the ferry house, which was my great-grandmother's house, she would also cook meals for like the pilots or just anybody that happened to work on the ferry boat. They could stay there if they wanted to. The ferry house was a very large house. It was, of course, kept in its old way, and it was just a real historical part of the Ohio.
I'm Judy Kappas, and I grew up in this county, and I remember the Martha A. Graham. As a child, we used to go down to the river and watch her go back and forth, bring cars and trucks back from Kentucky and vice versa. As I got older, I remember a bunch of us kids would get together and we'd go down, and if you rode the boat over and you didn't get off, you didn't have to pay. So every weekend or whenever we had free time, we'd go down and pester the ferry guy, and he'd let us ride the boat over to Ghent and back. And when I was a younger kid, my dad farmed, and he sold and raised and sold tobacco, and we always took it to Carrollton. So I remember that we loaded the big old truck up, and we'd take her down and get on the ferry. And usually I would get to go with him, not always, but when you got off the ferry, you had to gun the truck to get up the hill on the other side, and you couldn't stop when you got to 42 at Ghent, because if you did, you couldn't get back up the hill. It was fairly steep, and it was quite a ride. I remember in my later years when Martha Graham was still running, that, you know, if you wanted to go to Carrollton or Cincinnati, if you were going through Kentucky, you had to cross the river there or go all the way to Lawrenceburg. And that bridge in Lawrenceburg wasn't there then, but sometimes you had to go all the way up to the Anderson Ferry. So I recall the Anderson Ferry as well. But the Martha Graham in the later years, I always enjoyed driving down to the river and see her go back and forth across carrying passengers, and I was very sad when they decided that it wasn't going to run anymore. So that is my recollection of the Martha Graham. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Helen. Was Browning. I married a Smith, had 7 children. Raised them and went through this school system. When I was in the 3rd grade, we moved from the R.D. Salson farm out on Parks Ridge to a house across the road from Naomi and App Pillman down by the river. App run the ferry boat. Naomi stayed home. I don't think that woman ever left home for anything. She had a milk goat. You never had to even bend over to milk that goat. She had a ramp. That goat went up the ramp, and she just stood at the table, milked the goat. She was a wonderful cook. Loved to talk, mercy buckets. She could talk more than any woman I ever met. But the ferry boat always tied up on the Kentucky side over at Ghent. Why they did that, I never did really know. But in the wintertime, back then we really had a winter. The river would freeze over sometimes solid for a month or more at a time. And of course, App would miss his family and his missus. He would take a long limb off of a tree. We called it a tear pole, because back then, you know, people used limbs off of trees to hang the tobacco in the barn. They couldn't afford a 2x4 back then. And he would take this long pole and he would walk the river in case that the ice fell through, and he would keep him from falling through. It would hold him up so he could get out of the water. To my knowledge, I never heard of him ever falling through. It could be that he did. But he'd stay home for a few days and go back over and be in his ferry boat. Dad would raise tobacco, and he'd rent Carl Bennett had a big 2-ton flatbed truck, and he would haul our tobacco to Carrollton, to the warehouses over there, and we'd ride the ferry. And that was always a fun time. I remember Dad would always take us in and we'd get a sandwich or something to drink there at the thing and listen to them rattle off that auction and the people walking by. That was something to behold. I never will forget that. That was one fun time.
I'm Wilma, and this is my memory of the Martha A. Graham. We moved to Vevay when I was about 6. Shortly after, my great-grandfather passed. My family was going to Cincinnati, where the service was going to be, and we were going to visit with my grandma. And we rode the ferry on foot. We didn't own a car at the time, so on foot we crossed the ferry, my parents and my younger sister and my baby sister. And when we got to Ghent, we caught a bus and rode the bus to Cincinnati. And as a youngster, about 7 years old, this was a very cool experience for me because I got to ride the ferry for the first time and I got to ride a bus. So it was a pretty big deal.
Good afternoon. I'm supposed to tell you something about the Ghent Vevay ferry boat. I've lived on both sides of the river. I grew up on the Kentucky side here, where as a child we used to ride the ferry boat. If you didn't get off on the other side, you could ride free. So a lot of times we rode back and forth. If I had company visit, we all headed to the river to ride the ferry boat. If we had some money, cost a quarter if we got off. So we would go up to Max Rosenberger's soda fountain package store in Vevay, get some ice cream, maybe even shop in Vevay. There were stores in Vevay. I remember going over and getting an apron for my mother for Mother's Day once. And of course we could ride the ferry boat and shop and because nobody had a car, nobody was old enough to drive. So that's where we shopped. People came over here and rode across the ferry to work at the shoe factory in Vevay. There was a lot of foot traffic. And at that time, there were many people who did not drive, who did not have automobiles, but still needed to work. So Vevay was the ideal place, crossing the ferry boat, walking up the hill, and working or shopping. And so it was much more accessible for people here than going to Carrollton. And of course today with the bridge over Markland Dam, we all had to, there was no more ferry at that time. When I was teaching in Vevay in the 70s, 74, I was teaching in Carrollton at the middle school. And every morning I would get up to go cross the ferry. Well, I would get to the ferry boat and there was no getting across. It was tobacco season. And people would line up. I'd get up earlier and earlier trying to make the ferry boat till I figured out they would come down and camp all night long. So after being late for numerous days of trying to get across the ferry boat to school over in Kentucky, then I decided I had to drive around by Madison, Indiana. Cross the bridge down there to come to Carrollton to teach school at the middle school. So the ferry boat often would close and it closed every evening. So if you went somewhere, you had to make it down to the ferry landing in time to catch the last ride across the river, or once more, you had to drive all the way to Madison, all the way around by the only bridge in the area to cross into Indiana. We tried to save the ferry boat. Ralph Tilley was president of the Vevay Deposit Bank at the time. Dr. Tom Kaufman was assistant superintendent of Switzerland County Schools. And we kind of got together as a group. We thought it would be nice to save the ferry and have it to be used at the wine festivals and things for recreational purposes. But that didn't work out because it just was too, we had to abandon the idea. It was too expensive. Plus, nobody could figure out how we were going to maintain it if we did acquire it. So that was given up. And so today, to go to Vevay or from Vevay to Carrollton, people cross the bridge at Markland Dam. So that was the heyday of the ferry and the end of the ferry boat when they built the bridge at Markland, which was in the around 76, 77 were the last days. And the ferry boat may have gone before then. But I know by 78 they hadn't quite finished the bridge, and we had property in Indiana and we're living in Kentucky. And my husband would go to the farm and walk across the unfinished bridge.